Today we've got a neighbor of mine joining us, Seema Patel. Welcome, Seema.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you too. This is our second time doing an episode on bikes, so we'll see how it turns out. But can you tell our audience a little bit about your neighborhood and how you ended up there?
Sure. So I live in the central neighborhood of San Mateo, which is between downtown and the 101. And I ended up there because when we moved here in 2013, we started in Daly City and we drove all the way down to San Jose on El Camino, turning off at all of the little main streets along the way. And we were trying to figure out where to live, and we wanted to live somewhere that was walkable and bikeable. So we'd both lived previously in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and before that we'd lived in cities. And so we were kind of used to that urban, walkable, bikeable lifestyle and wanted that here. And when we turned into the San Mateo downtown, we were like, oh, this is a real downtown. There's stuff here. And it was surrounded by these residential neighborhoods within a really short walk. And Central is right adjacent to downtown, so that's how we ended up in San Mateo and ended up in Central. Walkability and bikeability was basically the factor in deciding where we were going to live.
Yeah. Did work was the driving factor in visiting the region, is that right?
Yeah, so I got a job offer to come work for a tech company out here, and that's why we moved. And at the time when we moved, my husband didn't have a job yet. And so that's why we were trying to figure out somewhere to live that felt somewhat centrally placed in the peninsula, that no matter where he got a job, it wouldn't be too bad of a commute. And the other nice thing about San Mateo is there's a Caltrain station downtown. And so that was the other huge factor, was walking distance to the Caltrain station, so that no matter where we ended up job-wise, we thought there's a pretty decent chance we could commute by train.
So your bona fides for talking about how to meet your neighbor are pretty ironclad, I would say, between your involvement in local government, which is how I think originally the two of us met.
Yes.
You volunteer in your role on the City of San Mateo's Planning Commission, where you've seen a lot of different topics come before commission.
Yes.
And I think even cooler is you've organized block parties.
Yeah.
And a lot of other organizing, community organizing. I'm curious about the block party because I'd love to reproduce and recreate that. How'd you do that? How'd you get into doing that?
So it started with my neighbor across the street. They own a bakery, and during the pandemic, a lot of the farmers markets where they sell their baked goods shut down. So they rent commercial kitchen space. They don't have a storefront. And so during COVID, they put a tent in their driveway, and on the weekend, they would sell baked goods out of their driveway for a few hours. And it was amazing. I'd lived in that neighborhood for, I think, 7 years at that point, and, never saw my neighbors all that much. And all of a sudden, there was a crowd in front of my neighbor's house, directly across the street. Every Sunday morning, I'd go out in my pajamas and my robe, pick a fresh scone to eat, and talk with my neighbors. And it was this amazing thing that brought our whole neighborhood together. And so our neighbors had the idea, we should throw a block party, we should bring a bunch of the different farmers market vendors together to set up on the block. And I, knowing a little bit about our city government and processes, offered to help them. And so that's really how I got involved. They did all of the major planning, and it was me trying to help them figure out how to actually get the permission to do it, which, as it turns out, is really challenging.
How is it challenging?
So one way it's challenging is that the current rules require you to get every address on the block to sign a piece of paper saying they're okay with closing the block for the time period of the event. And we live in an R2 neighborhood, so most of the properties on my block are duplexes or triplexes, so it's a lot of addresses, it's a lot of people to get. And, we probably spent a month trying to do it and still couldn't reach everyone. And I think language barrier was a problem too. There are a few folks on our block who don't speak English, and we didn't speak the languages they spoke, and it's a little bit hard to explain what we were trying to do. Yeah. So that was just a huge barrier in having to get permission from every single address, even when the closure is temporary. It's like half a Saturday. And then the other challenge is you have to put together I believe it's called Transportation Action Plan, which shows how traffic is going to be rerouted around the closed block so that the traffic isn't impacted, and you have to hire a consultant to produce that. And then because they were selling baked goods, they also had to get permits. Every vendor who was selling a baked good had to get a permit from the health department. And then if you were selling hot food, you had to get an additional permit on top of that. So my neighbors went to all of this effort to do this. And at the end of the day, even though everybody was selling things, my understanding is they basically broke even. So it was a lot of a lot of effort to have this kind of block party / local small business, everybody who has a little side hustle come out and share your goods. But really the main advantage and benefit was just getting the neighborhood together. None of the local neighborhood vendors, I think, really made much money out of it.
Have you gone on to do this more than once? Because I can imagine maybe once you've done it once, subsequent times are easier, although it sounds like based on the commerce or lack thereof, or the ROI or lack thereof, that it might have been hard to recruit people, like vendors, to come back. I think,
so the conclusion to this story is, unfortunately, my neighbors did it 2 more times and then stopped. And I think they would have been happy to keep doing it, even if they weren't making money off of it, just because it is a really great thing for our neighborhood and it brings so many people out and about. But it was a lot of work to go through to get the permission and to get all the permits. And then it turns out some of our neighboring cities don't have those hoops. So Foster City, which is trying to attract these kinds of small events, basically told them, you can come here and hold your event here for free. The cost of that transportation action plan and the cost of the permits was in the thousands of dollars. So Foster City and then San Carlos too, they do one in San Carlos now, both offer support for these sorts of events without any or much cost to the people organizing them.
I know you might not know the answer to this, but this sounds so self-destructive for the city of San Mateo or other cities like it to impose these barriers. And so I say that because it seems obvious, but also because they probably were put in place for some reason or other. Have you ever, or your neighbors, have they reached out to the city to try and change the rules and point to Foster City, our neighboring city, as a model to copy?
I think they did try to point out how other cities have made this easier, and I think they didn't have much success. When she was on city council, council member Lee expressed a lot of interest in trying to make this easier, and I believe talked to the city about trying to change the rules to require a fewer percentage of neighbors to sign the form agreeing to close down the block, to try to reduce the fees to be able to close the block. But ultimately, I think part of the challenge was because there were small business vendors who were selling things, this was triggering a different category of event. Whereas if it had just been a block party to close down the block and nobody was selling anything, but we were barbecuing on the street, I think that would have been different. But at the end of the day, these other cities don't require the same sort of fees to do these kinds of events, which benefit the small businesses in our neighborhood. And I'm not sure why we haven't been able to make this kind of stuff easier.
Well, I think it goes without saying that there's the law, and then there's what people do.
Right.
And traffic cones are pretty inexpensive.
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, enforcement-wise, I won't get into the food vending piece, but a block closure could go unnoticed for a few hours if you just put down your traffic cones. And
I know you spoke to Heather previously, and I know her block does something similar where they just kind of put out the cones and everybody sets up a table in front of their house. And I think because it's so localized to the block and everybody's in on it, it's not a big deal.
Yeah. Well, separate of the block party organizing, I know you through our mutual involvement and activism on a couple of political fronts. And for those who might not know our area, might not know contemporary local politics, you and I got, I think, initially connected over the generational housing affordability problems that aren't localized to our area, but are very pronounced in our area. It has everything to do with who is our neighbor, who can afford to be our neighbor, what their lifestyle must look like in order to live economically productive lives in our community. How did you get roped into that? Like, did you see that in Pittsburgh? When did you started becoming more civically minded about changing your neighborhood in that specific way?
Yeah, so when we left Pittsburgh in 2013, we were in the process of buying a house. And we were about to put down an offer when I got the job offer out here. And the house we were about to put an offer down for, its asking price was $99,000. And our budget was $125,000. And of course we came out here and we knew it was expensive, but it was still a little bit of sticker shock. And we found a place to rent in our neighborhood, a duplex. So we were in the rear unit of the duplex, and we started looking for a place to buy here because, you know, we were sort of the point in our life where we wanted to buy. And we tried to put an offer down on a house. This was in 2014 in the North Central neighborhood. And it was literally the cheapest house on the market in San Mateo. And we effectively put down this offer where we were offering 10% down, and our agent was like, "You're never gonna get this house." And we were like, "Oh my gosh, have you seen how much they're asking?" Like, we put down an offer on this house in North Central, and our agent told us, like, "You're never gonna get this house with 10% down." But it was literally the most we could cobble together. And at the price point we were talking about, we were like, surely 10% down is enough. And of course it wasn't, and we got outbid. And the kicker was when our agent told us that we were outbid by an all-cash offer. And we kind of had this moment of like, oh my gosh, like, we are never going to be able to buy a house here. If you need all cash offers to win, like how would we ever do that? And so fast forward, that was 2014, fast forward to 2020, it's COVID time. I'm working from home and someone knocks on my door during the summer and they have a petition and they're looking to get signatures to put a measure on the ballot in San Mateo to extend Measure P, which was a ballot measure passed in 1991 that sets a height limit of 50 feet and a density limit of 50 units an acre for any new development in San Mateo. And so this person wanted my signature to put this extension of this measure on the ballot. And I thought, as he was explaining things to me, I was like, surely I am not understanding you correctly. Why would we want to limit the amount of new housing? There's clearly not enough housing around here, and housing is too expensive. And when it became clear that no, I had not misunderstood him, I politely declined. And then I went back in my house and I Googled Measure P, because I was like, I didn't know anything about this. This was the first time I heard about it. And that was kind of how I fell into the rabbit hole of the housing crisis in the Bay Area, and specifically the constraints in San Mateo that had led to housing prices being exacerbated here. And I ended up actually volunteering on the opposing campaign, the campaign to not extend the ballot measure. And through that got involved with some of the local housing nonprofits, like the Housing Leadership Coalition and Peninsula for Everyone. And that was really it. That was how I got started. And a few months after that campaign, a spot opened up on the Community Relations Commission, and some of my friends in the housing advocacy world reached out to me and they said, oh, hey, there's a spot open on the San Mateo Community Relations Commission, which is responsible for distributing the federal HUD grants that can go towards housing, among other things. And they encouraged me to apply for it. And that was how I got involved with city government.
So somewhere in that timeline, you did become a homeowner and bought a home.
I did.
What changed for you? If anything.
So what changed was, number one, time. So being in the Bay Area for 7 years at that point, and having spent 7 years where both me and my husband were working in the tech industry and were able to save money for a down payment towards a house. The other thing that changed, and this is like very ironic, but we looked at houses that were more expensive than the ones we initially looked at. And we actually weren't planning on buying a house. We just sort of thought we would rent forever. And then if we wanted to buy, we'd move out of the area and buy. And then a house around the corner from where we were living in our duplex came up for sale. And we just went to go look at it and came home and said, oh boy, this is a great house. We love our neighborhood. Maybe we should try to put an offer on it. It was literally double the asking price of the previous house we had tried to buy. But I think because it was more expensive, it shut out the people who were offering all cash offers. So we were actually able to put in an offer that was competitive.
Has your politics, are you conscious of any way in which your politics and political views and values might have changed post becoming a real estate property owner?
I don't think so. I've heard people say, I've heard women say that becoming a mom only entrenches the beliefs you already had related to reproductive freedom. And I kind of feel the same way about being a homeowner. Like, it only makes me feel that much more passionate about everyone being able to have that piece of the American dream and to be a homeowner too. And I do think that maybe I am more tuned into property rights than I used to be, because now that I'm a homeowner, I want to be able to do things with my property that I am not allowed to do. And so I think I think more about that than I used to.
When folks, I don't know, what share of our audience owns a home, doesn't own a home, has ever owned a home, but there's an interesting history, of course, around zoning, like the government's ability to dictate how land can be used. There's also private agreements like homeowners associations or HOAs.
This is such a cute bench, by the way.
Yeah, the wooden one, yeah. I love the exercise workout.
I love that they have accessible equipment too. It's fantastic.
Oh, yeah. They have one here and they have one just down the way right here. We're going down a lesser traveled portion of the San Francisco Bay Trail. And you probably noticed, I'm just going to narrate for our audience how loud it was. We just crossed over Highway 101, which is the Bayshore Highway. It's like, I think 5 or 6 lanes wide, 12 lanes wide, and is a major traffic generator running all the way from San Francisco to San Jose, north and south beyond there too. But reaching this beautiful green space is pretty hard. Like, we just had to bike a mile minimum, mile and a half, 2 miles, I think it's 2 miles, just to get to that highway overpass. So now that we're here, we can appreciate it. It's a little smelly though. It smells like nature, yeah. Well, it also smells like all the sewage drainage that reaches the bay via gravity, and the sewage treatment plant, which we just passed, of which there's a few. But we were on to zoning and HOAs, and I was wondering, between public and private restrictions on how land can be used, which would you say is a bigger problem, or like what's the magnitude of how these restrictions affect people on an everyday basis? Because I don't think a lot of our audience spends their time or energy on a daily basis thinking about, oh, I would love to live in San Francisco, for example, but it's that dang San Francisco city government that blocked that one construction project from happening, and so oopsie daisy, the rents are too high in San Francisco to permit me to live there, or San Mateo. So how would you speak to a layperson who doesn't maybe know about how government dictates how land can be used?
Yeah, and I think the question you asked is like, what causes greater restrictions, HOAs or local governance? And I think the answer for sure is local governance. An HOA might care about what color you paint your house. I think far bigger impact is local jurisdictions enacting rules on how land can be used. So in the Bay Area, I'm going to forget the exact number, but I know it's like roughly 73% of land is zoned for single family homes, which means the only thing that you can build on that parcel is a single family home. And there have been state laws recently that have tried to loosen those restrictions. State ADU law allowing anyone to build an ADU. SB 9 allowing in most places a homeowner to split their lot in half and build up to 2 units on each side. So some of these restrictions are loosening, but by and large, we still reserve a vast amount of our land for single family homes. And that just makes it really challenging to build more housing.
So Seema, why does the government restrict so much of this land, 75% or more, for what we technically call single family homes? What's the reason? Like, is it, democracy? Or I know this is, I'm asking this kind of sarcastically, but I think very few people really think about local government.
Yeah.
And what's the difference between the decisions that local government makes and the decision that state or federal government makes. So, yeah, I realize I'm asking a leading question, but what's the big deal with single-family homes? Why do people in our community seem so, at least status quo, seem so set on restricting the type of home in our community to this so-called single-family home?
There's this great book called The Color of Law that people should read if they are more interested in this topic. But, and this can be, I think, a sensitive subject, but historically, zoning was enacted. It first came into existence right here in the Bay Area in Berkeley, where single-family zoning was created as an attempt to exclude people from areas who may not be able to afford a single family home, but could have afforded an apartment or a duplex in the same area. And so it was originally used as a tool of racial exclusion. I don't think that's why we perpetuate its use today. I think a large part of why we still have single family zoning is because that's the way it's been for 100 years, almost. But I think you ask an important question, which is, why have we retained it?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm wondering. Why does it retain its appeal, I guess?
Yeah, I think that perhaps part of it is it's been around long enough that it's what many people know and what is familiar. And so there can be a lot of, feelings and uncertainty and fear around changing from something you know to something you don't know. Especially when we're talking about where we live, people are concerned about negative impacts. And so I think there is often a lot of worry. You hear people talk about, I don't want a 10-story apartment building going up next door to my house. It'll affect traffic. It'll cast shadows on my own property. So I think that is part of it too, is the fear of something different that might have negative impacts on me.
I think for a lot of people, there are some physical aspects of their living environments that lead to people putting a really big premium on living somewhere with lower noise pollution.
Yes.
And that communal residential multifamily housing that might have shared walls.
Yeah.
You mentioned traffic. Traffic is a huge source of noise pollution. We've heard a lot of it on our bike ride over here, mostly from heavy-duty vehicles. But it's true that also in communal living or multifamily housing that you don't have as much control over noise pollution. I think there's merit to those concerns, and there's a price people are willing to pay to.
Yeah.
But to use the government to prohibit certain types of shelter from existing is a next level use of the law.
I would say that part of it too is home ownership has always been part of the American dream. And I think that a very specific picture of home ownership has become enmeshed on that American dream, since the 1950s, watching sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver or, whatever else was on at the time, Dick Van Dyke, right? Like everybody was living in a suburb with a single family home and a white picket fence. And that kind of became the picture of home ownership. And especially right now, because ironically of the constrained housing supply, home ownership is a huge vehicle for acquiring wealth, right? Wealth generation. House prices go up, it's a great investment. People's retirement is tied into the home that they own. And so I think there is also a hesitancy to move away from housing that is ownership-based and into housing that is rent-based, because home ownership is such an investment vehicle right now. And because I think models of ownership that aren't single-family homes aren't either as well known or there aren't as many of them. Like in San Mateo, we do not have very many condo buildings. There's very few condos for sale at any given time. I think the last time I looked, there were 5 in the whole city.
And are there any coming up, like folks who are seeking permits to build condos? Yeah.
Yeah, that is something. Yeah, that is something that we've seen very recently, like since Measure T passed. There's been 2 applications that have been submitted to build townhomes, which are higher density than single family homes, but obviously not as high density as like an apartment building. And I think the reason that's happening right now is because of the economic climate and the financial situation, that it's easier to get financing for townhomes than it is to get financing for apartment buildings. And so I'm actually excited about more opportunities for home ownership in San Mateo. So we'll see.
I think one thing I've noticed about the range of housing options, renting, buying, is how the government sticks its head in various ways that people would never think that the government has the ability to influence. I mean, at the base of things is interest rates and the national bank's ability to dictate what the rate at which banks can borrow at, and what ultimately consumers can borrow at to be able to purchase. I mean, I don't know what the statistics are, but I've got to imagine 90+% of residential home purchases are done with a loan.
Right.
So the government has that tool of influence, but a few others that I've learned about recently, well, I've known about some of these for a while, like the government mandating that you need to have vehicle parking, whether the resident wants it or not, whether the marketplace of supply and demand desires it or not.
Actually, what's interesting recently is, again, state laws are starting to loosen some of these restrictions. So there's this law called AB 2097 that says that local jurisdictions can't require off-street parking in new development projects that are within a half mile of major public transit. So it's a pretty good amount of area in San Mateo. And what we're seeing is that projects are still getting submitted that include off-street parking, and it's because the lenders are requiring the off-street parking because they're worried that those residences won't be attractive to tenants if they don't provide off-street parking.
So there is a market floor for demanding off-street parking.
Well, there's
a lending.
There is a lending market that is demanding off-street parking. I think it's still a little TBD to see if the end users are demanding it in the same way that they used to.
The second kind of subtle influence of the government on housing that's created that I was thinking of is, you mentioned townhomes and condominiums, there's subtle differences between the two, I think.
Yeah.
But I was in Florida recently, and I was learning how the collapse of the Surfside condominium building in Miami, or outside of Miami, led to the state of Florida passing laws requiring that condominium homeowners associations have to set aside a minimum reserve requirement of cash from their HOA dues.
Yeah.
And to fund repairs and retrofitting. And this doesn't sound objectionable at first blush, but the reason it strikes me as interesting is there is no such mandate for single-family homes.
Right.
The government doesn't tell a single-family homeowner you have to set aside 2% of your home value every year to fund potential problems. Yeah, so the side effect of that kind of regulation has good intent and reacted to a disaster, but the side effect is it makes condominium ownership less attractive.
Yeah.
And so it and more expensive. Hand in hand, yeah. So I've been thinking about all these various subtle ways that well-meaning government regulations have the effect of steering people to types of homes and rent versus buy decision-making that wouldn't happen, would happen differently if the government wasn't stepping in these ways. So just thoughts on my mind. Are there maybe there's other things that you're familiar with about how the government subtly affects the market for housing, whether local to your neighborhood or our city or the region? You mentioned AB 2097, which is a state one, but are there local ones that are on your mind?
That's a really good question. I'll have to think on that one. Something that comes up is impact fees. So what is an impact fee? So when any new development project comes before the planning department, in order to get building permit approval, the applicant has to pay impact fees. And I want to be careful because I don't have our impact fee schedule memorized, so I don't want to misrepresent it, but you can find it easily online by searching San Mateo impact fees.
This is common to
virtually every jurisdiction does this, right? But it'll basically say something like the project needs to pay 1% of the building value towards funding schools, or needs to pay 1.5% towards public art, or needs to pay 0.5% towards transportation infrastructure. I don't remember the exact percentages, so don't quote me on them, but I believe that we have like around 7, maybe more, different impact fees that we charge developments.
We being the royal
the city of San Mateo charges developments. And again, don't quote me on it. Google it. Sure. You can find the updated schedule.
This is Seema speaking as an individual, not in a role.
Thank you. Thank you for the disclaimer, Max.
Just as my neighbor.
Yes, just as your neighbor. And so I don't remember, like, for example, there's a park impact fee, and I don't remember the exact percentage, but I remember this coming up in another jurisdiction in the peninsula, where it might have been Redwood City, where when you were doing the math on some of these apartment buildings, the project was basically having to pay something like $25,000 a unit into the parks. And to your point, that is not something that single family homes do on the same scale, right? Like, you do have to pay impact fees when you submit for a new single family home, but obviously the value of the home is much lower, so you're paying a lot less from a percentage standpoint. So people who are living in apartment buildings are paying a much higher percentage towards the maintenance and upkeep and development of amenities that benefit the entire community. And I think the other thing is, like, when in my neighborhood was built in the 1920s, right? So maybe in 1929, when my house was built, there was impact fees. I don't think there was. But if there were, the amount of money that was paid at that time is much less than the amount that is being paid by apartment buildings today. And so Redwood City did an economic breakdown a few years ago that is amazing, that shows how much per unit multifamily dwellings are paying into infrastructure and amenities compared to single family dwellings. And unsurprisingly, because of these fees, multifamily dwellings are revenue positive and single family dwellings are revenue negative. And so the infrastructure and amenities is actually being subsidized by multifamily dwellings.
Yeah. Fascinating. And is this,
I'm hoping that we could do a similar economic impact study in San Mateo, because I think it's really helpful in understanding how important new development is to maintaining our infrastructure and amenities, and I think would help us make decisions about how we can continue to fund these sorts of needed repairs and improvements.
Okay, Seema, we're going to do a little...
We're off-roading.
We're doing a little bit of mountain biking. But we have the benefit of motorized electric bikes to help our pedaling up what's a pretty steep public park, county park.
I didn't have a flat, could use my big knobby tires.
Those tires are pretty wide and knobby. We're visiting our local county park on the San Francisco Bayfront called Coyote Point Recreation Area. A really underutilized park asset in our area, largely because it's hard to get here by walking or biking. But there's county parks and rec staff who I think live on site and police the space. But it's a great place to go picnicking and whatnot, and biking. Yeah. Got a lot of eucalyptus trees, which aren't native to the area. Well, I feel like we've gone super deep geeky. How can we circle back to meeting your neighbors? I think there's some aspects that I've gotten interested in recently. I think you and your husband, Colin, do a really good job of making the front of your home friendly. I know you guys do some gardening or seating yourselves and recreating in the front of your home on the curb, and gotten to know your neighbors perhaps in that fashion.
Yes.
Can you share some maybe tactics of how that came about, whether intentionally or accidentally?
It's a really good question. So I think one thing that really helps is the previous owner of our house was a gardener by profession, and he had planted really extensive vegetable garden, both in our side yard, we're on a corner lot, and in our rear yard. And I think our property had 16 fruit trees when we moved in. And so one thing that I think really helped us meet our neighbors is the previous owner of our house had been feeding our neighborhood for years. And so after we moved in, a lot of people showed up and, would introduce themselves and ask about the previous owner, and then say, do you still have the garden? Are you still growing things? Could I have a few lemons off your lemon tree? And that actually sharing produce has been a great way to meet people. We had a whole bunch of lettuce in our backyard the first few years because of the previous owner, and we put it out on the curb because there was no way we could eat so much lettuce on our own. And someone stopped by to pick it up, and we happened to be outside, and they mentioned that they had chickens and that the chickens love lettuce. And then I started leaving boxes of lettuce on their front step because we just had too much and people weren't taking it. And then they started leaving cartons of eggs on our front step, and that was really awesome. We also put up a little free library on our front fence, and we see a lot of people stop by to exchange books, which is really cool. And I think part of it is we just spend time in the front yard too. And so if you're out in your front yard and people are walking their dogs or going for a jog, you just kind of naturally say hi. So that's been a great way to meet folks in our neighborhood.
Well, I think one thing we should maybe circle back to before we call it quits on recording is that professionally, this stuff aligns pretty well with what you do. And obviously you're not talking on behalf of your employer now, but can you share a little bit about what your day job is?
Yeah, so my day job, I work for Google, and I'm in their real estate department, and I work on the design of spaces that are open to the public, and thinking a lot about how we provide how we provide spaces and amenities to the local community that are useful and beneficial. And previous to that, I worked in both the museum industry and the theme park industry, thinking about how, again, designing these sorts of spaces and thinking about how we engage people in physical space, particularly from the standpoint of both storytelling, like how do we tell stories in physical space, and how do we create spaces that are vibrant, spaces where people want to be and where they want to connect with each other and connect with their surroundings.
Oh my God, we need another episode. If folks wanted to check out some of the spaces that you have worked on in your career, can you point folks anywhere? I realize they might be distant, but folks might be able to look it up online.
The very first thing I worked on, like now we're going down on a rabbit hole, straight out of grad school, was when I was at Walt Disney Imagineering, and it was called the Kim Possible World Showcase Adventure Game. And it was an attraction in Epcot in Florida where you would check out a flip phone from a kiosk. I'm dating myself here. And we had enabled these flip phones with RFID, and you get sent on this scavenger hunt around the World Showcase where you got clues and you had to help catch bad guys. And the cool thing about it was a live action adventure game. So as you approached the spaces where you were supposed to be, things in the environment came to life. So that was a really fun project to work on. In my time at Google, I've worked on a bunch of executive briefing centers. You might be able to find some information on them if you Google them. I led the design of a space in Redwood City called The Grove. And then more recently, I'm working on the visitor experience at Google. So that is open to the public at our main campus in Mountain View. We have a store and a cafe and a community space that are all open to the public. So that's probably the easiest thing for people to check out.
Okay, well, is there a way people can get a hold of you if they wanted to? I feel like that's the standard way to plug anything you'd like to plug.
Sure. I mean, folks can email me. My email is seemadp@gmail.com. It's probably the easiest way.
Okay, cool. Well, we're going to have to circle back for another episode about placemaking because that's a deep topic, and I mentioned it in the channel trailer. Something to talk about, and I think you'd be an awesome guest to do that with. So we'll do this again, and maybe on bikes again. I don't know. How did you like the bike format?
The bike format is great. I will say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is what I tell people at work. Shelter and water and restrooms are a good place to start in creating vibrant places.
Makes sense. Maybe not in your front yard, but but hey, it works. Thank you, Seema.